Welcome to the Deep Dive.
And welcome back to you if you're a regular listener, or a very warm welcome if this is your first time tuning in.
It's really great to have you with us. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jessie.
Today, we're taking a really deep plunge into a topic that is, well, incredibly complex, often misunderstood, too.
Yeah, and it carries, significant weight. We're talking about Antisocial Personality Disorder, or ASPD.
It's one of those conditions that really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About behavior development.
And how society responds,
Yeah.
healthcare, justice systems, all of that.
Exactly. And our mission here in this deep dive is to unpack it. But importantly, we're doing this only using the specific sources you've shared.
Right. We've got a stack here. Clinical guidelines, research papers, some on substance use connections, even texts on the history. It's quite a collection.
So our goal isn't just like reading facts off a page.
No, not at all. We want to guide you through what these specific documents say, find the key insights, explore the history, the definition, the impact.
The approach is discussed, all grounded right here in this material. Think of it as maybe a shortcut to get informed on what these particular sources offer on ASPD.
And there are definitely nuances in here, challenges, surprising bits too, buried in the text.
So let's dig in and see what comes out.
Yeah.
Okay, so starting with the history. Where do these sources say this whole idea of antisocial behavior as a specific disorder actually begins?
Well, the sources trace it back surprisingly far, all the way to the 19th century, actually.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they point to this concept of moral insanity, which, get this, was apparently accepted in courts back then. That's pretty striking, isn't it?
Moral insanity. Sounds quite old-fashioned, like a defect in character, maybe? Not really a health condition as we'd think of it now.
Exactly. But the documents show this idea. It sort of evolved. You had figures like Koch in 1891. He used the term psychopathic inferiority.
Inferiority, linked to the brain.
Yes, Koch talked about a congenital or acquired inferiority of brain constitution. So it shifts a bit from just moral towards something potentially, inherent or biological.
Okay.
Then Kraepelin, 1905, he gives us the broader category, personality disorder itself.
Right. And the sources really seem to zero in on Schneider from 1923. His definition sounds memorable. What was it?
Schneider. He described psychopathic personalities as those who, quote, suffer through their abnormalities, or through whom society suffers.
Yeah, that's powerful. It really captures both sides, doesn't it? The internal struggle and the external impact.
It really does. And, as the sources point out, that idea of suffering either for the person or for society feels like a direct line to how modern diagnoses require distress or impairment.
Makes sense.
But the material suggests the real bedrock for our modern view, especially of the antisocial type, was Henderson in 1939.
Henderson. Okay. What was his contribution?
He defined psychopathic states. He focused on people with normal intellect, but who showed disorders of conduct of an antisocial or asocial nature pretty much throughout their lives, persistently.
So the focus sharpens onto the behavior, the antisocial conduct.
Exactly. And then U.S. researchers followed, really cementing antisocial and aggressive behaviors as the core things to look for.
So it's quite a journey traced in these documents, from moral failing to brain inferiority to this broader personality pattern causing suffering and finally locking on to that persistent antisocial conduct.
Yeah, a real story of shifting perspectives on what's driving these difficult behaviors. Okay, so moving from that history to how these sources define ASPD today. They start with a general framework for any personality disorder.
Right.
Which is basically an enduring pattern, inner experience, behavior that's really different from cultural expectations.
Yeah.
And it's pervasive, inflexible.
Starts young, stable over time.
Right.
And causes significant problems, right? Impairment in functioning.
Precisely. Then the DSM-5 criteria for ASPD itself, which the sources detail, get really specific about that pattern. It's defined as this pervasive disregard for and violation of the rights of others.
And you need to meet, 3 out of 7 specific criteria listed in the source?
Yeah. Instead of just listing them all out, maybe let's look at the kinds of behaviors they capture.
Good idea.
Okay, so one cluster is about breaking laws, doing things that could lead to arrest.
Then there's deceitfulness. Lying, using aliases, conning people, manipulation.
Impulsivity, too, not planning ahead. And then irritability and aggressiveness, like repeated physical fights or assaults.
Reckless disregard for safety is another one, their own safety or others.
And consistent irresponsibility, like can't hold down a job or doesn't honor financial obligations.
And a really key one the sources highlight.
Yeah.
Lack of remorse. being indifferent or maybe rationalizing when they've hurt someone or treated them badly.
Exactly. Taken together, these criteria paint a picture of a behavioral pattern that's, well, disruptive and often harmful to others.
The sources also mention the ICD-10 system uses a different term, Antisocial Personality Disorder.
They do. The criteria overlap quite a bit, but maybe with slightly different nuances. Like ICD-10 emphasizes disregard for others' feelings more strongly, or incapacity to feel guilt or learn from, say, punishment.
So different systems, slightly different angles on similar issues.
Right. And the DSM-5 also has that alternative model mentioned in the sources. It focuses more on these fundamental impairments in, like, self-functioning identity, self-direction, and interpersonal functioning, empathy, intimacy, plus problematic traits.
Just another way to conceptualize the underlying problems, basically.
Exactly. It gives a different lens.
Now, these sources, they really paint quite a stark picture of the life trajectory, often linked with ASPD, the impact.
They do. They point out how traits like impulsivity, high negative emotionality, easily feeling anger, anxiety, and low conscientiousness, how these are tied to widespread problems, socially, interpersonally.
And what really struck me was this description of a cycle of disadvantage, often starting really early.
Yes, that's powerfully described. The documents note that individuals who develop ASPD frequently come from fractured families. Lots of conflict, maybe harsh or inconsistent parenting.
Which can then lead to, being placed in care outside the home.
Right. And that experience itself is strongly linked in the sources to other problems down the line, like truancy, hanging out with delinquent peers.
Early substance misuse, not doing well in school, lower educational achievement generally.
It's like a cascade, isn't it? One difficulty leading to another.
A real snowball effect, yeah.
Yeah.
The sources say these early issues often result in much higher rates of adult unemployment, unstable housing, chaotic relationships.
And tragically, higher rates of imprisonment or even premature death, often due to reckless, dangerous behaviors.
So it's not just about specific symptoms in isolation. The sources describe this broad pattern of problems stacking up, leading to these really adverse long-term outcomes.
It underscores that complex interplay the sources talk about between maybe inherent traits and the environment someone grows up in. Now, one of the really critical areas these sources dig into is how ASPD connects with other conditions, especially substance use disorders, or SUDs.
Yeah, this seems like a major takeaway from the documents. They stress a very high rate of comorbidity.
Extremely high. The prevalence rates they cite for ASPD within clinical samples of people with substance misuse problems, they're striking.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, the range given in the sources is huge, from about 23.5% up to over 81%.
Wow, even the low end, 23%, is way higher than in the general population.
Oh, absolutely. Significantly higher. And one of the sources we looked at, that MedArxiv paper, it specifically flags strong links with alcohol use disorder, cannabis use disorder, and tobacco use disorder.
Okay. And didn't that particular source get even more specific, looking at which symptoms of SUDs were most linked?
Yes, that was really insightful. It analyzed individual diagnostic criteria for SEDs and found certain ones were particularly associated with ASPD, even after accounting for other factors.
Which ones stood out?
Let's see, hazardous use, social problems, neglected roles, physical problems, and, interestingly, attempts to quit.
Huh. And how do those connect back to the core ASPD traits we talked about earlier, the impulsivity, irresponsibility?
Well, the source suggests a direct link. Hazardous use, for instance, that's tied to disinhibition, right?
Yeah.
Which overlaps a lot with impulsivity and antisocial traits. Neglected roles, social problems, those clearly map onto the irresponsibility and disregard for consequences.
It gives a much more granular view of how these disorders intertwine at the symptom level.
Exactly. And the sources also touch on differentiating ASPD from narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, which can be tricky as they often occur together.
Right. What distinction do the sources offer there?
They bring up work by Millen and Davis. The idea is that the person with ASPD is driven to actively take vigorous action for self-benefit. They expect they need cunning, deception, effort to get what they want.
So they're actively scheming, manipulating, because they don't just expect things to fall into their lap.
Precisely. Whereas the narcissist, according to this distinction in the source, kind of assumes good things will come their way with minimal effort. It stems from that sense of entitlement, often unjustified.
So actively taking versus passively expecting. That's the key difference highlighted.
That's the distinction offered in the material, yeah, as a way to try and tease them apart.
Okay, shifting gears a bit.
Yeah.
The sources spend a lot of time on how people with ASPD actually interact with healthcare and society more broadly. And it sounds like there are some unique challenges here.
Definitely. They introduced this idea of treatment rejecting versus treatment seeking.
What does that mean exactly?
It's a crucial point. The documents state that people rarely, if ever, seek help specifically for the ASPD itself.
Oh.
They usually only end up in services because of something else, like a comorbid substance problem, depression, anxiety, or often because they're basically forced to be there.
Forced, like by the courts,
Yeah.
or maybe a family crisis.
Exactly. External pressure. And this resistance, or in being coerced into treatment, the sources say it clashes directly with core parts of the personality structure in ASPD.
Which must make therapy incredibly difficult.
It really does, and it contributes to really high dropout rates from treatment programs. The sources really emphasize this. Services need to get this dynamic. When someone with ASPD does present, it's often under duress, and understanding their core issues is vital for any chance of effective engagement.
Given that dynamic, maybe it's not so surprising then when we look at where the sources say people with ASPD are often found, particularly in prisons.
Yeah, the statistics cited in the source material are pretty stark.
How stark are we talking?
Well, international surveys mentioned put ASPD prevalence at around 47% for men and 21% for women in prison populations globally.
Almost half of male prisoners globally?
Yeah. And the specific UK prison data included in one source. The numbers there are even higher. 63% for male remand prisoners, those awaiting trial, 49% for sentenced males, and 31% for female prisoners.
Those are just huge numbers compared to the general population. It really underscores that strong link the sources describe between ASPD and the criminal justice system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also really important, and the sources are careful about this, to distinguish ASPD from psychopathy.
Right, they aren't the same thing.
Not exactly. Using the PCLR, which is a common assessment tool for psychopathy, the prevalence in that same UK prison sample was much lower, somewhere between 4.5% and maybe 13%, depending on the exact score cutoff used.
So many more people in prison meet the behavioral criteria for ASPD.
Then meet the criteria for the more severe construct of psychopathy, which includes specific emotional deficits like lack of empathy and interpersonal traits like manipulativeness on top of the antisocial behavior.
Got it. That's a key distinction the sources make.
The sources also touch on the economic side of things, the costs associated with ASPD, though they do say the research here is a bit limited, especially for adults.
But they give some figures, right? I remember seeing something about high secure hospital costs.
Yes, they cited a mean cost of over £65,000 per person, just over a 6-month period.
That's a massive expenditure.
It is. And looking earlier at childhood conduct disorder, the sources reference research estimating a mean annual cost of around £6,000 per child.
Wow. And who bears that cost?
Mostly families, actually. The source indicated about 78% of that cost fell directly on families through things like extra time needed, managing difficult behaviors, and so on.
And for adults with ASPD, even if the total cost is hard to pin down.
The sources suggest the cost of the offending behavior itself is likely a major driver. Things like police and court costs, prison costs, victim costs, security measures, it all adds up.
So it clearly has these wide-ranging economic impacts hitting families, public services, the whole system. You can sort of hear the societal impact in those figures. But the sources also give us a window into the really personal side, the experience of getting an ASPD diagnosis and the stigma.
Yeah, this part of the material feels very humanizing. It includes direct quotes from people diagnosed with ASPD sharing how it felt.
What did they say?
One person called it a label you get when they don't know what else to do. Others felt it meant they were seen as bad or evil.
That sounds devastating.
Someone else described it as feeling like a life sentence, untreatable, no hope. Really heavy stuff.
And finding out accidentally, like seeing it in your records, which the sources mentioned happened to some, that must make it even worse.
Intensifies those negative feelings, absolutely. That sense of just being labeled, maybe written off.
And for those in prison, the sources mention specific worries.
Yes. Concerns about the diagnosis leading to longer detention. And this really difficult feeling. Worrying that things shared in therapy, trying to be open, could potentially be used against them in risk assessments.
That must create such a barrier to trust. How can you engage openly if you fear that?
It's a huge barrier. That tension, especially in forensic settings, between the therapist trying to build trust and help and the system's need for a risk assessment, it's a massive ethical challenge highlighted in the sources.
Definitely.
But it's not all negative in the sources. They do share some positive experiences, too.
Oh, like what?
Some prisoners apparently really valued the support they got from professionals. They were keen to start treatment. And some talked about successfully learning to control aggression through programs.
So change is possible, even in difficult circumstances.
It suggests connection, support, and the capacity for change are possible, yeah? That comes through in the sources, too.
Given all these complexities, these challenges in engaging people, the sources also talk about what helps staff working in this area. What characteristics are useful?
Right. It sounds like it takes a particular skill set and resilience.
What kind of qualities do they list?
Things like being responsive, flexible, but also really good at maintaining clear boundaries. That's crucial.
Being able to empower people, too. Like allowing them space to try things, even if they make mistakes sometimes.
Exactly. Emotional maturity is flagged as essential, and a high degree of personal resilience.
Maintaining a positive outlook, hopefulness, while still being realistic about limits, that sounds like a tough balance.
It does. And also a willingness to self-reflect, to talk about mistakes openly with colleagues. Working well as a team is presented as fundamental.
And the sources stress support for the staff, too, right? Supervision, training.
Hugely important. They suggest training should cover specifics about personality disorders, but also general therapeutic principles. And ideally, delivered to whole teams together, not just individuals in isolation.
So supporting the staff is basically integral to providing decent care in this area.
That's the message from the sources, yes. Okay, so thinking about actually addressing the behavior, promoting change, the sources look at different approaches, and there's a strong theme of intervening early.
That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Given how often the difficulties start in childhood with conduct disorder, and the sources mention evidence for treating adult ASPD itself is kind of limited.
Right, so there's this real focus on preventing ASPD by intervening much earlier.
And the sources sound quite positive about early childhood interventions, like in the first 5 years.
Very positive. They highlight evidence showing these programs don't just boost school readiness, but lead to a whole range of good long-term outcomes, including significantly less delinquency and crime later on.
And the cost-effectiveness numbers you mentioned earlier, they were pretty impressive.
Yeah, the sources cite average economic returns exceeding costs by a ratio of 6 to 1. That's a huge potential long-term saving for society, besides the human benefit.
What kind of programs are we talking about? The sources gave examples.
They did. Things like nurse home visiting programs supporting vulnerable mothers with health, childcare, family stability, sometimes involving fathers or grandmothers, too.
There was the high scope program mentioned, too. Long-term follow-up showed fewer arrests, better education, home ownership.
And cost savings of something like $7 for every dollar spent, according to the source. And child-parent centers were another example, focusing on ongoing support, parent involvement, literacy, also linked to better school outcomes and fewer juvenile arrests.
So a key recommendation seems to be identifying kids at risk early. Maybe those with vulnerable parents, young moms, parents with their own mental health or substance issues.
And building that identification into existing systems like healthcare or early years services, it's about building a stronger foundation right from the start. And building on that prevention idea, the sources also cover interventions for kids who already have conduct problems.
Okay, so not prevention, but treatment for existing issues in childhood. What works there, according to the sources?
Parent training programs get strong backing. Clear clinical and economic evidence supports them, especially for younger kids.
Like what ages?
Programs like parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT for maybe 3 to 6-year-olds, or the Oregon model for slightly older kids, say 5 to 12. And the sources mention group formats might be more cost-effective. Potentially, yes. And for older kids who maybe don't respond fully just to parent training, the sources suggest adding interventions focused directly on the child. Things like cognitive problem-solving skills training.
And for teenagers, say 12 to 17, with more severe conduct problems, maybe offending history, at risk of being placed out of home.
For that group, the sources point to multisystemic therapy, MST, and functional family therapy, FFT.
Right.
These are more intensive approaches, working with the whole family in their environment, school, community. And the sources say there's evidence they can reduce rearrest rates.
When we get to adults with ASPD, though, the picture shifts again based on these sources. It sounds like most care happens outside formal health services.
That's a key point. It often requires coordination across lots of different systems. Education, social care, housing, probation, criminal justice. Like multi-agency public protection arrangements, MPA panels are mentioned as an example of this coordination.
So interventions need to be multimodal, involving multiple agencies, maybe over long periods.
Often, yes. Trying to address that whole cycle of disadvantage we talked about. Within healthcare or forensic settings, psychosocial interventions are used.
Therapeutic communities were mentioned.
They have a history, yeah. But the sources note challenges they're expensive, and the evidence specifically for ASPD compared to other personality disorders isn't that strong according to the review.
What about targeting the offending behavior itself, especially if there's substance misuse involved?
The sources mention cognitive and behavioral interventions showing some promise there. Reasoning and rehabilitation is one program cited as having some effect on reducing reoffending, though the economic case wasn't entirely clear-cut in the research reviewed.
So, adult interventions often seem focused on managing specific behaviors, like offending or substance use, rather than curing the underlying personality pattern.
That seems to be the emphasis in much of the material, yes. And that leads us perfectly to maybe one of the most practical and important takeaways from these sources, treating the comorbidities.
Right. This came up again and again, even if treating the core ASPD directly is hard.
The sources are really clear. People with ASPD can definitely benefit from treatment for other things going on, like substance use disorders, depression, anxiety.
And they can benefit potentially as much as people without a personality disorder.
That's what the sources suggest, yes. Now, the presence of ASPD might mean treatment needs adjusting. Maybe it needs to be longer or delivered by therapists with more experience in complex cases.
But the core message is, offer treatment for those comorbid conditions anyway. Don't withhold it just because ASPD is also present.
Exactly. Treat the depression, treat the anxiety, treat the substance misuse, because successfully managing those can significantly improve someone's life and might even help reduce some of the risks associated with ASPD.
And didn't the sources mention something specific, working for substance misuse in this group?
Yes, contingency management got a mention. That's where you provide positive reinforcement, like vouchers or privileges, for sticking with treatment goals, like providing clean urine samples. The sources indicated that showed promising results for SUDs in people with ASPD.
Okay, what about medications? Pharmacological interventions. What did the sources say about using drugs to treat ASPD?
The conclusion here, based on the evidence reviewed in these documents, was very clear.
Which was?
Medications should not be routinely used to treat ASPD itself, or for the associated behaviors like aggression, anger, impulsivity. The evidence just wasn't there to support it for the core features.
But what about for those comorbid conditions, like if someone with ASPD also has clinical depression?
Well, that's different. The sources clarify that medications are appropriate and should be used for comorbid mental disorders like depression or anxiety, following the standard treatment guidelines for those conditions.
Okay, so treat the other conditions with appropriate meds.
But, and this is an important but, with caution, be mindful of adherence issues, potential for misuse or diversion of medication, and overdose risks, which might be higher in this population.
So no meds for ASPD core features, but yes for comorbidities, just carefully.
That's the guidance summarized from these sources, yes.
And finally, the sources talk about access to services, which sounds like it can be a real hurdle for people with ASPD.
It can be. So the sources make this strong principle-based recommendation
What's the principle?
that people with ASPD should not be excluded from any health or social care service just because of their diagnosis or because of a history of antisocial behavior or offending.
That feels vital because, as we've said, they interact with so many systems. They need to be able to get help wherever they encounter the system.
Exactly. The sources also highlight minimizing disruption during transitions, like moving from prison back to the community, keeping support consistent.
And talking openly about the diagnosis.
Yes, discussing it and its implications with the person, maybe family, staff involved, acknowledging the stigma that exists, but emphasizing that effective treatments for the comorbid conditions are available and should be accessed. And just before we wrap up, the sources were also good at pointing out where more research is needed, the gaps in knowledge.
Okay, what did they flag?
Well, they called for direct comparison trials between MST and FFT for adolescents to figure out which one works better for which specific kids.
Makes sense. What else?
They suggested research looking at whether effectively treating anxiety in people with ASPD actually improves the long-term course of the ASPD itself. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, does creating one help the other?
Exactly. And also evaluating therapeutic communities in prisons, but specifically for people with ASPD who don't have major substance misuse problems, as a lot of the current evidence mixes those groups.
So, still some key questions the experts who wrote these documents are grappling with. Well, that really was a deep dive, wasn't it? Guided completely by the source material we had on antisocial personality disorder.
We've covered a huge amount. The history, how it's defined, that challenging life path often linked to it, the high rates of substance use, comorbidity.
How it differs from something like narcissistic personality disorder,
Yeah.
the big challenges around treatment engagement.
The prevalence in prisons, the costs, the impact of stigma, what helps staff.
And then looking at interventions, the real hope offered by early childhood prevention, according to these sources, the approaches for kids and teens, the complexities for
The
adults.
absolute must-do of treating comorbidities, and the clear guidance on medication.
It's definitely clear from this material that ASPD is complex. Understanding it, managing it, preventing it,
Yeah.
it involves so many systems.
And often requires this commitment to intervention starting really, really early in life.
So as we finish up this deep dive, maybe a couple of things to leave you thinking about drawn directly from these sources.
First, consider that potential impact of those early childhood interventions. The sources talked about returns maybe 6 times the cost, affecting crime, education, health. If that's accurate, does it change how you think society should prioritize resources for prevention?
Or think about that ethical tightrope described in forensic settings. The clinician needing to build trust, but also potentially having to use disclosed information for risk assessments that could impact detention. How does a system navigate that inherent conflict ethically?
These aren't easy questions. They come right out of the complexities discussed in the sources we explored today.
Complex topics deserve ongoing thought.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into antisocial personality disorder based on these specific sources.
We really hope you found it insightful, maybe gave you some things to consider. Take care of yourself out there.
And please, if you found this valuable, maybe consider subscribing or sharing this deep dive with someone else who might be interested. Leaving a comment always helps too.
It helps us keep exploring these important and often difficult topics together. We'll be back soon with another deep dive.
Until then, take care.